if it's a new facility, the most common problem that you have, it's always running the PVC pipe, whether it's Schedule 40 or Schedule 80 first, and then deciding how many plants you're going to have in that room, and then changing the flow rate, not planning, the correct flow rates to that application, to where when you get the system started, it's not going to work properly. As a manufacturer, one of the things that we're liable for is we're supposed to deliver the correct amount of water and nutrient to those plants, right? We're like the last defense and the most important part. Even though we might not be the most expensive, right? We're the most liable for doing that part correctly. With that being said, if it's a new facility, that's probably where it's at. And then not choosing the correct components to add to those sites. Like, for example, if you have a bench and you're using, and I don't sell any pumps, but I work with them all the time. If you're using a liter pump, you can install that liter pump and then run your irrigation system to that bench, right? And if you don't have any pressure regulation at that bench, right, you're going to get uneven water distribution because the pressure that goes in, let's say, you're managing 70 PSI right at the start, and you're only pumping a few gallons a minute. You get those 70 PSI, drippers are only able to work between a certain pressure. And what people don't understand, and if you're ever going to take anything from me from whenever I talk about irrigation, is that pressure and flow are two different things, right? And we seem to confuse that a lot. Where if you use a DAP pump, right, you're able to lower the pressure on that DAP pump and manage that pressure a little better than you normally would on a liter. Now, the reason why I use this as an example is because it's the same company, right? And I'm not biased to any of them. But if you're going to use one over the other, for whatever reason, we need to understand how that product works. And then also how we're pretending to deliver the correct amount of water to that bench. Now, kind of going to where that dripper works at, where it's happy, I'll speak to for myself. Like, we have two styles of drippers, right? We have a medium operating pressure, which opens up at 17 PSI. And there's a good thing about it, right? But you need to understand how it actually works. And then we have one that opens up at 9.5 PSI, and they both range up to 50. So anywhere in between, you're good. Now, with that being said, if you have two benches now on this instance, right? I was on a site yesterday here in San Diego, and it's a common problem, right? That we're using a liter pump, but no pressure regulation at the bench. So what happens now, let's say you turn on one bench at the same time, and because of the length of the room, now we have 55 PSI, for example, at that bench. Well, you're already over pressure. Does that mean that dripper, it's going to fly out the tubing? No, it only means that because of friction, we're probably not going to deliver the correct amount of water that we promised because you're not within working specs. Or if you kick on the second bench, now we might be at, 50 PSI, right? With both of them on. And so now they might be working properly, but it comes down to, and I think, you've probably seen it in the past, to where you look at a bench or you look at a room, and then the beginning of the room looks tall, right? We got the tallies, and then at the end of the bench, or midway down the row, or at the end of the row, we got the shorties, right? Well, you could have the best of the best out there installed, but if you're not using it correctly, I mean, it comes kind of down to that, right? And it's a broad question, but I do think that adding a little bit of components to the mix would be able to solve a bigger problem. People say, well, what about you're selling pressure regulators, you're selling, gauges, you're selling fittings. And but I wouldn't like to sell you something that you're not going to be able to use in a correct setting, right? And as for me, when it comes to troubleshooting, if you have those components on there, we can go through the room, we can do it quickly. And if you don't, we could still do it, but we just take a little bit longer.
I think from my perspective, it matches up with that pretty perfectly, because we get a lot of questions about crop steering, and people want to jump into advanced stuff a lot of the time, but you can't do that if you're not getting uniform delivery to your plants to start. It's just a garbage protocol if you have the perfect crop steering system, but there's a huge amount of variability across your system. So a lot of the time it just is, what are we doing, when we're fixing uneven watering and hydroponic setups? And like you're saying, that means we have to get everything into the right PSI range, make sure all the drippers are the same, there's the same amount per plant, the pressure's correct, the flow rate's correct. And it's, surprising to me because we look at a lot of facilities and you see like pretty basic mistakes. Like nobody ever, when they designed their zones initially, worked through and was like, okay, we got this many plants, we're doing 2 emitters per plant. The flow rate for each emitter is this. The room's broken up into this many zones, and that means we're going to need this flow rate for each zone. And, we want to be between that, 15 to 50 PSI or 20 to 50 PSI range, and then pulling up the pressure curve of their pump and seeing, okay, will it deliver that PSI range at the flow rate for this zone? And a little bit of early planning and math. I guess it's just sometimes people aren't comfortable with math, but a little bit of math goes a long ways towards preventing a lot of those problems. And so, yeah, we spend a lot of time walking people through this as well. Of course, even doing that, you want to make sure that the components are good. That's why I really like the Rivulis components. The Super TIF emitters, you've got a lot of cool features on there that we use in different setups. So like the minimum opening pressure can be really useful in certain setups, having them not drain when they shut off, all really good. But yeah, I think a lot of people just overlook how important it is to make sure that like each of your plants is actually getting the volume they're supposed to when you do a 3% shot or a 5% shot or whatever it is.
Right. And you're going to deliver the correct amount of water and nutrient to your plants. Your hydraulics should be spot on. And till this date, I have yet to fail on a facility when I recommend something to fix it. Yeah, there's like every other manufacturer, sometimes there's a bad batch, or it could be something that someone did, or maybe a pump went out, or the filter. When do we check filters? How do we check filters? What's the correct way of checking for them? Screen versus disc, and what do we do, right? And these components are very, very important because every nutrient is different and every grower is different, right? So for me, like, I have to be able to work with every single grower across America, right? And adapt my product to the way that he grows. He's not going to adapt his growing strategies or skills to the way that should be really done. I just have to be make myself available, right, to be able to help them, and then B, make sure that before I sell anybody a product, I always like to run the hydraulics really quick and say, oh, okay, yeah, this will work. So on a new facility, that's a common problem, right? When you're not spending, thousands of dollars for a design, and even when you do, the irrigation is probably not part of it unless you fork out an extra amount in order for you to do that. That's, I think, where I've been like very successful at marketing Rivulis, is because I help out with that part. Now, on an existing facility, that's totally different animal, because the components are already there. Somebody already spec'd them out or put it together the way that they saw somebody else do it. Maybe the pipes are already there, whether it's Schedule 40 or Schedule 80. What are the most common problems there? Well, if you built a facility to use a 2-gallon per hour dripper or a 1-gallon per hour dripper and you step it down, typically you won't ever have an issue, right? Because you're not using as much water as you normally would. The problem is vice versa. If you spec that facility out for a lower flow rate, right? Now we step it up. Like, I'll throw myself in that mix, right? My lowest dripper is a 0.29 gallon per hour, right? If I spec that out for that, and then somebody comes in and uses a half a gallon, right? now we're increasing the amount of water that you're going to use. So we need to, before we plug those in, we need to be able to make sure that you're going to be able to deliver that amount of water to those areas, whether you're running one single zone at a time, or if you're running the whole room at the same time. Or even, I'll go even higher. Let's say you started with 2 assemblies, you're using a half a gallon per hour dripper, but now you went from 2 drippers to 4 drippers, right? Which is not uncommon at all. And so now we just double that yield, and we have to make sure that the drippers are working properly. Typically, you'll find out pretty quickly, within the first harvest, if it's something's happening or not, because you'll go up to that dripper, and many times, right, you'll go ahead and you'll pick up a dripper and you're like, it's not working, and it's not dripping. You go over there and tap it and it works. You're like, okay, so that dripper's clogged, right? And more than likely, I bet you that dripper's not clogged. It's more of a hydraulic problem. So, it's a cool feeling, to be called for something like this, but sometimes, it's work, right? And so we just have to make sure that the components are correct and that we're delivering the correct amount of nutrient and water. And that's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously with us on both sides of the fertilizer and the irrigation components, we're getting calls all the time about clogged emitters or how to avoid clogged emitters in fertigation systems. And on the fertilizer side, we do a lot of stuff like, we're looking really carefully at pH injection and pH adjustment to make sure that people aren't feeding at too high of a pH or contacting a really high EC solution with an undiluted pH up or something like that. We're also looking at line maintenance, filter cleaning, things like that. From your side, on the irrigation component side, what do you tell people who come to you with clogged emitters or about how to avoid clogging emitters in the first place?
Yeah, so having the correct filtration, and I'll grab a filter here. I'll start taking it apart because it's a big old assembly I have with me, right? But I'll take it apart and then I'll kind of show you on a filter and why a filter is important. And when it comes to servicing a filter, I mean, it's pretty simple. You open it up and then you check to see if it's dirty or not. But there's a lot of ways that you can do it. Some facilities will tell their guys like, hey, I want you to service this filter like every day, right? Or I'll filter it once a week. And some guys, you ask him like, do you even have a filter? He's like, what's that, man? Like, what's going on? I always say like I should have been like a pressure gauge salesman, right? Because I do a pretty good job at it. But even though it's just a component, it works, right? So this is just a basic, Rivulis filter. The water will come in this side, it'll come out the other side. There's 2 pressure gauges on there, and you're like, man, like, what is that, right? It's also a disc filter. A lot of people say, well, what do you prefer, screen or disc, right? It's really preference, right? Depending on what you're running out there. Maybe if you're coming out of a tank, you'll do disc, and if you're going into a bench, you'll do screen, or vice versa, or you'll just do one of a kind. To tell how to clean this little dude, so if the water's coming in this way, right, your pump should be reading the amount of pressure that's on the upstream side. So it'll tell you if you're, let's say, liter pump, right? You're pumping 70 PSI, you got 70 PSI coming in. And then on the downstream side, now it's the dirty side of the filter, it should be telling you once you have a pressure differential of between 3, maybe top 7 PSI, you should be cleaning that filter. So now it's telling you when to service it, right? So I tell the guys, just mark it, with the red marker, and tell your guys, like, just pay attention to it. You don't have to open it all the time, but just make sure that you're paying attention that it's working properly. Now, downstream on the bench, there's always typically a pressure gauge that's at the end of the bench that will let you know if your drippers are working properly or not, right? So screen versus disc, well, about 25% more cleaning surface on a disc than a screen, but it's also easier to maintain unless you're using stainless, right? We also have a stainless version of it. But features, you see a lot of discs out there, they don't have these ports, right? If you already chose what you're using out there, or somebody chose for you, right? You might not have those features. So now we have to think of plan B, right? On how to do it. Now, when you clean your drippers, there's a few ways to do it. The most common way that I've seen it done is that you put your cleaner in the tank, you mix it, you push it downstream, and it's always working. And the dripper's always working at the same time. Well, drippers aren't meant for that. And then you fill the system, right? And then you let it sit there and everybody's different. Could be, an hour, could be a day, could be 4 hours. Everybody's different. They'll let it sit there, and then they'll turn on the system. And then you're trying to get all that biofilm, all that crud, like anything that's running through there while the dripper's working. And drippers aren't meant for that. We're supposed to do maintenance under the operating pressure of the dripper so it doesn't open, right? And then we should clean out the tubing first, flush out that solution. And if you really wanted to service that dripper, now we can service that dripper after the fact, right?
So real quick. So when we have our customers do irrigation line maintenance, post-harvest cleaning, we usually have them use some sort of acid cleaner to break down any precipitated minerals that might occur, and then follow that up with some sort of sanitizing agent. And, people have different components. Obviously, some people are going to have emitters with different opening and closing pressures and things like that. Hopefully everybody's got like a flush valve on the back end of their zone loops and things like that. So maybe you could break down in like two specific scenarios, or like scenario one, somebody's got a bunch of emitters, they need to clean them on the table. They're planning to run like an acid cleaner and then a sanitizing agent, and they've got flush valves, and the minimum opening pressure for their emitters is 5 to 9 psi or something like that. What do you think is the best sequence for going through their post-harvest line cleaning in that sort of scenario?
Well, if you don't have a way to crank down the pressure to where that dripper's not opening, I would recommend probably opening up the flush valve at the end of the line and then fill the line up. Once it starts filling, close it, but don't run your system. Just let it sit there, right? And you probably want to do that with the whole room at the same time, as opposed to doing one single table, right? And then if you, when you come back and clean it, let's say, and everybody's different once again, right? The magic number to let that cleaner sit in there, it's different for everyone depending on what they're using. Let's say I'll just throw out a number, 3 hours, right? So when you clean out that system again, then what I would do is I would come out and I would open up the flush valves in every single one of those zones and then run it again to make sure that you're taking all the biofilm, anything that's stuck in that tubing out first. And then if you really wanted to service the dripper, now you can come back, close those flush valves, and then run your chemical again. I wouldn't do it for any more than 5-10 minutes, and then you're pretty much done. And then just hit it with clean water after that, right? After you're all said and done, hit it with clean water, and then you're good to roll to when you start adding plants to your room again. I'm not saying like just to be fair, right? I'm not saying like do this while your plants are still in the room. I'm saying after you harvest it and you're maintaining it, that's when I would hit it.
Yeah. So it sounds like best case scenario here is a kind of like a 2-part procedure, where first part is really focused on the lines, filters, all of those components, and you're putting your acid and your cleaning solution through those, and then letting it sit, flushing it out through the flush valves, and you're not pushing anything through the emitter at all in that first one, because you want to get out all of the biofilm, anything else that's built up and been dislodged in there, flush that out. And then if you want to clean the emitters themselves, you'd come back through for a second pass, and you could push that cleaning solution, like the acid or the sanitation solution, through the emitters at that point, because you've cleaned out all of the other large particulates and dislodged debris and things like that. Is that about right?
That's correct. One of the things that are going to help you out is having either a manifold. And right now, I don't want to speak out of term. I'm doing, some testing on the way that it should really be done, right? We have two drippers. We have a low opening pressure that opens up at 9.5 PSI. And then we have a medium opening pressure that opens up at 17 PSI. I'm doing the testing to see which one is the best bet. But with that being said, it's always needs to be different. And you kind of need to know a little bit about how it works too, because your pump has a lot to do with it. If you're only running 80 PSI or 70 PSI and you can't control how much pressure you're going into that, then you're going to have a manifold. And if you're able to take it down, to, 30 PSI or 36 PSI as a minimum, you might be able to get away with it.
Can you break down exactly what a few key terms mean? Especially, so we've got like an opening pressure, and we also have a sealing pressure. And some people might be a little confused about what are the distinctions between those. So how do you see those and what are the differences?
Yeah, so our drippers have a check valve, right? So I'll kind of give you that by educating a little bit on the dripper. So the dripper will have a check valve, and the check valve is important. Why? Well, it retains the water in the tubing after the initial start. So what it's meant to do is there's PC, which is pressure compensation, right? Which is going to give you the certain amount of water after it hits a certain pressure, right? And then there's PCND, which is pressure compensating non-drain, right? And what that's gonna do, it gives you a certain amount of water at a certain pressure range, and it also will give you a sealing pressure and an opening pressure. Now, a sealing pressure, that's after it's open, they're all supposed to shut down at the same time. And everybody's a little different, so I'll just speak for one of my drippers, right, which is at 2 PSI. So once it hits 2 PSI in that line, right, it'll hold that water in that tubing, and the dripper will be turned off, but it'll hold the water inside of the tubing. It'll retain it. So the next time that you water, you're going to get a true shot, right? And that's the difference on that. Now, the opening pressure, 9.5 PSI versus 17 PSI, right? On the two styles that I have, well, one of them is going to open up literally at 9.5 PSI, which everybody typically has, right? Now, the 17 PSI will close at 4 or 5 PSI, right? And it takes a little bit higher pressure in order for it to close, but it also takes higher pressure in order for it to open. And once that happens, right, you're able to work on your maintenance, a little difference between the two, right? And I started with the low opening pressure because that's where the market was at, right? But I've been very successful with the medium opening pressure because maintenance purposes. And, some people understand it. Those guys love it and say, yeah, let's do it. And there's other guys that, nah, just let me have the same thing. And we keep rolling right as it is.
Yeah. I really like having the emitters with the little bit higher opening pressure so that you can really dial in your in between line cleaning.
If you're going to talk irrigation, if somebody is talking about pressure, it's probably the wrong topic. We should be talking about flow rates and pressure. At least for us in the indoor sector, right? We can always increase that pump, or that pump already comes like souped up with, the correct amount of pressure. We need to be sizing everything based on flow. And if you need help, just use us as a resource, to be able to accomplish some of these things. Sizing your pumps correctly, using the correct fittings, on the pump are very, very important. I'm surprised that when you need to go from 1 inch, because that's typically the inlet on a pump, right? You go from a 1 inch to an inch and a half or a 2 inch. There's actually pump start connectors that can help you do that, achieve that part. And it's kind of a shame on our part that we don't talk about some of those things. I've seen sometimes the irrigation to the room might be perfect. And then you get to that pump and the supply from the tank to the pump is incorrect, is less than what the demand is. And then from the pump to the manifold, it might be incorrect as well. So we're already on the wrong path to begin with. So it's just like one thing after another. And, air reliefs, like nobody ever talks about air reliefs. And I'm not talking about on the tables. I mean, if that pump starts and product shaking on the walls, right? You've got a problem. So just,
So say somebody is, we've got a facility that is doing really good line maintenance procedures. They are keeping up on all of their filter change and all of their upstream stuff with water and things like that. How frequently should they actually have to replace their emitters on the table and those sorts of components? I've had facilities where with good maintenance, everything continues to last for 5, 6 longer years. I don't know if that's advisable to keep things that long. What do you think?
Well, you're asking a drip manufacturer, man. We want to change them like every couple runs. No.
You tell me. Honest answer.
No. But with that being said, on a serious note, proper maintenance can sure, take it a long way, right? And it's kind of like I would look at drip irrigation as, and I'll go back to this same thing once again, right? On the little dudes that are supposed to deliver the correct amount of nutrient at the correct time in order for you to harvest the correct amount of flour, the right amount of flour, whichever that is. I also do consider that even with common practices like drip irrigation should be changed frequently. Well, I'm not going to put out a number out there and say, Omar wants to change it every 6 months, or if you're doing it every 6 months, once a year, I think you're doing a good job. If you're not, I would consider that you're relying on that same dripper that you've been using for a while, kind of like an LED light, man. It's still going to put out light, right? It's still going to work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to put out, the correct amount of water forever based on, all the stuff that we throw at it. We do acid, we do special formula, like everybody's different, right? And we throw all kinds of things at these guys that, it's not it wouldn't be an uncommon practice, but again, like I don't want to throw out a number out there like, you should do it every 6 months, every year. It should be up to the grower. Like, hey, it's been out there for a while, right? Maybe it's time, to do so. And even if you see, like, even if you think like you've got some uneven water distribution, right? We should be able to check hydraulics, make sure that we're doing a proper maintenance. And even with that, that's why we got milk cans out there. Like we're able to make sure that they're putting out the correct amount of water. If you're off, then it should be considered.
Yeah. Oh, that's great to know. That actually reminds me of another kind of specific question I had on the design side of things. So, you imagine your zone on a table and you've got your 17 millimeter tubing that's running around. In some facilities, I see them run the tubing down in straight lines with it not connected in a loop at the end, and maybe there's a flush valve at the end of the line, or maybe not. In most of the setups I've done, I've really liked connecting that loop all the way through and then teeing off for a flush valve, and also maybe teeing off for a pressure gauge down there. What do you guys prefer when if you were able to say this is probably the ideal setup for most people in terms of how to arrange that 17 millimeter tubing on the table?
Yeah. So, and then tubing's a whole different conversation, right? So, you'll probably get me started on this other path here.
Perfect.
But 17 millimeter tubing will hold about 5 gallons a minute at 5 feet per second, right? Which is where you want to be at. Going back on uneven water distribution, if you have too much demand on the table, that 17 millimeter will probably be not good enough. So now you have different sizes, right? You got 18 millimeter tubing, which people call, and I'll come back to your question. I won't forget, but this is good because I think that people should know, right? Then there's something smaller than 17 millimeter tubing, which is 520 tubing, which is rated for 3 gallons a minute at 5 feet per second, right? But it's still considered in the half-inch family, which is 600 by 700, 17 millimeter, 520. It's still considered under the same family. So based on manufacturing, right? But the flow rates are different. So, with that being said, now we got 18 millimeter, right? Which takes a PL 70 fitting. And then you have 820 by 940, which is a true 3/4 tubing. So 18 millimeter, right? That will take a PL 70, right? Fitting will deliver 6 gallons a minute at 5 feet per second, but people call it 3/4, right? And 820 by 940, it's a true 3/4 tubing, and it delivers anywhere from 8 to 9 gallons per minute at 5 feet per second, right? Which is a rule of thumb. That's why I keep saying 5 feet per second. And people can test me out there. They can go and grab a catalog and look at the flow charts, and I don't ever want to say anything different, right? So that's why I memorize them so well. But going back to that, I mean, tubing has a lot to do with that facility, because a lot of people might be running 3/4, but it's not really 3/4. They might be running 1/2 inch, but it's not really 1/2 inch, right? So you put that pressure gauge down at that table and that flush valve, and it might seem it's working properly, but now we have a hydraulic problem on that bench. And it comes to how many plants we have, right? And how much water we're pulling. But to answer your question, going back to the original one, before I went off on a tubing tantrum here, right? I would prefer to see a closed loop, right? A flush valve and a pressure gauge at the end of the system. The flush valve would give you the ability to service that system, cause most friction at the end, right? On a personal opinion. And then also adding that pressure gauge at the end of the table would allow you to see if you're having any issues, right? While you're running that table, and if your emitters are acting the way that they should be. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, that was perfect. I see that there's some automatic flush valves as well that work in various ways. A few companies make these, where when the pump turns on, the irrigation begins to go. These flush valves will release a certain amount from the end of the zone, and before they reseal, and then water and nutrients get delivered to the plants. What's your thought on these automatic flush valves and having them on zones?
I don't have a problem with the automatic flush valve. I mean, obviously we manufacture them and we put them out there. It's the preference within the grower. What you should account for, though, it's how long it's going to stay on for. You need to account for the amount of nutrient that it puts out to be able to run it, to run your shots a little bit longer, because it's draining at the end of the table at the same time, right? So it might be, some of them go from, 1/4 of a gallon up to 3/4 of a gallon, right? In reality, like our flush valve, and I'll just speak for myself, it's got a low setting and a high setting. When you're under 5 gallons a minute on that bench, you should be on the low side, right? It'll put out anywhere from 1/4 to a 1/2 gallon, per minute, based on the length of that, table too, right? So if you got a 40-foot table, is different than if we had, a 100-foot table or 80-foot table. So it might be a little different, but you also have to remember that, the water, most of the water will be retained on that tubing, right? So we just have to account for the extra watering time and the extra fill time if you're using a automatic flush valve. But I will say that I have one of my growers that absolutely loves them, and he's helping me learn on a good piece that we're going to put out there on why you should be using a automatic flush valve. So that's coming soon.
Cool. I'll be looking forward to seeing that. Yeah, it's something I haven't used them much myself, but it's something I was curious about. And my main concern was that you've got say you've got 10 irrigation zones, and they've each got their own automatic flush valve. So that you've got a half gallon going out per zone. And then, at certain times in a cycle, if you are doing really high frequency, small irrigations, maybe you're running 20 shots in a day.
Right.
Then that's so you're basically on a single zone, that's 10 gallons per zone. And if you've got 10 zones, that's an extra 100 gallons of flow rate that's getting lost through those flush valves. So at a certain size that, I was just factoring in oh yeah, this could burn through some extra nutrients and water, which may be worth it, but it was just something I was considering.
Right. And that's something that I'm working on, with one of my best growers that we have out in Tucson. And he's helping me with the piece. And I think, the way he explained it to me, right. It made a whole lot of sense, right? But I would be a moron if I try to explain it to you right at this minute and try to say the same thing, because my opinion as an irrigation guy and his opinion as a grower are totally different. And I think that it made sense. And he's running some really large zones out there. I mean, it's 100-foot, tables, and it's more of a greenhouse. It is a greenhouse setting. Right. And it's it works for him, and he absolutely loves it. And he's got, 500 or 600 of these things just out there, and it's okay with him. So I think that, before I go off and try to make some sense out of it, right, I relearn that part from him. So I'll stay tuned on my comments on that. But
nice.
On the basic comments that I made, that's what we have to consider if you're going to consider automatic flush valves.
Cool.